Are you ready to take your business to the next level? Every day there are countless books and articles that are published offering the key on how to make your business a success. It's easy to feel overwhelmed trying to keep up and run your business. That's why Deb Creer created the Business Power Hour. Keep up on the latest trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. Let the Business Power Hour do the heavy work for you.
Good morning, good morning. I am Deb Creer, and I am passionate about giving professionals the tools that they need to make themselves and their businesses as successful as possible. And today we're going to be talking about something that is very timely for our times, but it is also something that is evergreen because we're going to be talking about data. And oh my gosh, let's be honest, we are overwhelmed right now with data, and it's very confusing. And so we're going to be talking to an expert about this, and because it really is. It's confusing. Should we be using it? What do we need to be doing? All these various things. And we shouldn't be ostriches. We shouldn't be hiding our heads in the sand. So, it's going to be a great conversation today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Johnson to our program today. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Hi, Deb. Great to be here. I'm excited to talk about my favorite topic, data.
Perfect. I love it. Well, let me tell people a little bit more about you, and then we will just dive into this. So Dr. John Johnson knows HR data like few others. As a PhD economist who analyzes the issues of liability and damages in labor and employment litigation, John understands how to transform companies' raw, messy data into meaningful analysis and reliable results that empower informed decision-making. A teacher at heart, John is known for his ability to explain technical concepts simply and clearly. John is also a business owner and entrepreneur who appreciates the power of harnessing data in running a high-performing organization. 10 years ago, he founded Edgeworth Economics and has since built the company into a world-class economic consulting firm. And in 2019, he launched Edgeworth Analytics to meet the growing demand for sound data analysis in human resources and other business services. So again, John, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. As I said, I'm looking forward to it. We have a lot going on in the world. So
I know.
Today.
So let's kind of go back a bit, though. Tell us how it is that you got to where you are and how you discovered that this really is your passion in life.
Well, I went to graduate school, and I really thought I was going to be a professor the rest of my life. Okay. So I, was always a teacher. Mm-hmm. I loved teaching. And so when I graduated from MIT, I was a professor at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I was there about 2 years, and I very quickly, although I was potentially going to be one of the most popular economics professors there, I kind of found the work to be a little impractical. Okay. And I found it a little lonely, to be honest. Mm-hmm. Being a professor is not quite as, you interact with your students, but a lot of your work is doing research by yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I always really cared about data, but really practical problems. So I decided to talk to my wife, and I decided, I don't think this is for me. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to move to Washington, D.C., and I took a job in a consulting firm where I worked for several years and kind of learned a little bit more in this space of sort of litigation consulting, testifying in litigation about different data type issues. But even that, as much as I liked the work, I hit another point in my career where I maybe I was a bit of a know-it-all, maybe I just had my own ideas, but I just thought I had a better vision for how the business part of it could be run. So I did something that people thought was kind of crazy. In 2009, right in the middle of the Great Recession, I left and started my own firm with a few of the people that I had worked with for years. And went out as an entrepreneur. And, we really were at the time selling customer service, attention to our clients, how to budget this type of work, how to explain things simply. And so, that was the start of really this major part of now my life. And so my firm now, has been in existence. That part of the firm has been in existence 11, 12 years. And the, analytics firm has sort of come into play in the last year or so, where we're trying to move a little bit more from just pure litigation to also helping companies before they're in litigation.
Right.
That's kind of my story.
I love it. And we were talking before the program that we're surrounded by numbers, and more importantly, sometimes we don't know that we need the numbers, and many years ago, when I was working on my master's degree, I took a class in statistics. And, and I'm not a numbers person, for me, 1 and 1 doesn't always make 2.
Mhm.
But I remember, some of the things that my statistics professor said were, when you're asking questions, obviously how you ask the question is absolutely critical, because you don't want to lead the answer. And so that's very tricky. And then I remember he also said, and you can kind of make the data say whatever you want the data to say. And I thought, what the heck? And then I realized he was right, because, you can even just in how you word things, you can say, instead of saying 95% of said yes, you could say, oh my gosh, a majority of people said yes. Okay. That could take that down to 50%,
Sure.
and so you're, and you're not lying, clearly it was still a majority, but, so things like that. So data has always fascinated me, because it is, it's how you ask, it's how you interpret all of these various things. And as I said, we're completely surrounded right now by data, whether it's the number of COVID cases or the elections or all of these various things. And so that's why I really wanted to get into this with you. And so let's kind of, for those of us, and you have been a teacher, you are, an ongoing educator in this. Talk to us about some of the basics that a lot of people don't even know. Let's talk polling. We'll start with the big guy on the block, because I'm in Atlanta, so we're kind of surrounded by it right now, and will be for another 2 months.
Yeah.
How there's just so many questions that the people have about
Well,
polling.
Well, why don't we start with sort of first, I think that, the perspective you explained about the fact that people really do think numbers can be sort of twisted or turned in a way to sort of say whatever someone wants. There's always a degree with lots of things in life. You need kind of an honest broker, right? You kind of have to sort of approach this. I think the benefit of data is that it actually does bring rigor. And if it's done well, even if someone's pointing towards an answer, the assumptions that went into the data, the types of things that matter. There's a few years ago, I wrote a book about misleading data. And there was one of the examples which I thought of when you were describing about baby food. There had been a series of ads about baby food, and 4 out of 5 pediatricians basically prefer baby food. But when you actually dug into the numbers, what it actually was the survey was not 4 out of 5, because it was, first they asked pediatricians if you'd recommend baby food at all. And if you said no, you were knocked out.
Right.
And they asked if you'd recommend a specific brand of baby food, and a whole bunch of those left. Then they asked, well, if you recommended baby food and a brand of baby food, would you recommend Gerber baby food?
Right. And this was done by that company, right?
Right, exactly. So yes, 4 out of 5 pediatricians who recommend baby food and recommended a brand of baby food recommended Gerber baby food. That's a very different interpretation. So every time when I hear people talk about data, it's sort of, that's one of our examples of sort of cherry picking.
Right.
So why don't we transition to polling? Because I think that's a good setup, right? So polling, what a situation we find ourselves in. After 2016, the polling industry did a real deep self-reflection. And again, to sort of be clear about where I fit into this, I'm someone who reads and interprets polls. I don't conduct polls myself. But I'm a data analyst, and so I've commented on polls, things like that. So, and so the polling industry really looked into at the time, how could they have missed the mark so badly?
Right.
A lot of what the narrative that was developed was, well, the national polls got it roughly right, but the state polls in 2016 were low quality and missed huge swaths of voters in Michigan, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania. And that was
the swing states.
And that was the reason why the perspective was that the polls were so wrong. So polling agencies did a lot of work in the intervening time to sort of try to deal with those issues. And one of the things you heard a lot about is sort of trying to get the education levels actually into the weighting of the samples, because that's sort of a big part. At the end of the day, all polls are only as reliable as the sample which they're
Right.
drawing. If a
Mhm.
sample isn't representative,
Mhm.
I can give you any numbers, I can give you any totals,
Mhm.
right? When we talk about the polls being wrong, it's not because
Mhm.
they added the numbers up wrong, right?
Mhm.
The people they asked those questions to
Right.
said that. And so
Mhm.
people who asked the questions to, on average, the national polls were about 8 to 10 points for Biden.
Mhm.
In many of these states, there were very large leads.
Mhm.
Now, it's still early. I
Mhm.
don't want to
Yeah.
pretend that we know
We're not
everything.
exactly
Right.
sure of the outcome. We're
But,
like 99% sure.
but what we are, the first thing that seems to be very disturbing
Mhm.
is that the direction of the bias in the polls
Mhm.
all was in the same direction, which
Mhm.
means they all undervalued, understated the level of support for Donald Trump in the
Right.
poll. And since they're all in the same direction, that points
Mhm.
to a systematic error in
Mhm.
the polling.
Right.
So that's a big problem, because if you
Mhm.
have a systematic error in
Mhm.
one direction or other, you don't want that, right? Like
Right.
you really want
Mhm.
okay, well, if you make a mistake one way,
Mhm.
it gets canceled out the other
Mhm.
and it sort of averages out. So that's why polling now, in some respects, 2020 may well go down as much worse than what
Mhm.
happened in
Right.
2016, which really is going to put the polling industry in a bit of a crisis.
Mhm.
What happened necessarily? Well, there's a lot of theories
Mhm.
floating around right
Right.
now. One is that COVID,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
How did that fundamentally
Mhm.
change who picked up the phone, who answered the
Mhm.
calls? That's
Mhm.
one part. There's still what is called the shy Trump phenomenon.
Mhm. Right.
Trump voters in a setting where um, President Trump questions
Mhm.
institutions, people who support him also question institutions. Polling
Mhm.
is one of the institutions,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So there's sort of that issue. And
Well,
then there's
and people didn't want to admit that they might be supporting him, even if it was to this anonymous voice on the phone.
right. And then another thing, the other direction, very fervent Democratic liberal support, right? This
Mhm.
has been a year
Right.
where we talk about the very energized
Mhm.
liberal base.
Mhm.
Well, that goes the other way. They really want to answer the survey and say, yes, I'm going
Right.
to vote for Joe Biden.
Mhm. So
So
they see it on their caller ID and they're like, must answer, must
let's talk
answer.
about it, right? Let's get out there. So
Mhm.
you've got that's sort of the early, again, and there's still a
Mhm.
lot to be dissected.
Mhm.
But that's kind of the early quote unquote returns on
Mhm.
what potentially is wrong with the polling
Right.
now. And I don't know how you start to fix that, but the
Mhm.
reality is there are still, again, large identifiable groups. In this
Mhm.
case, it looks like older voters,
Mhm.
it looks like Trump supporters that were missed
Mhm.
again in the sampling.
Right.
If people either aren't telling the truth, but
Mhm.
more important, if you can't get the samples right,
Mhm.
the polling is not going to be all that
Right.
useful. Sort of,
Right.
what do we do? Do we build in that we expect a 5 or 7% sampling error
Right.
every
Mhm.
single time? If we do that, that's
That's getting pretty close to, is it even valuable?
right. So I think, if you ask me to look at my crystal ball, I suspect there will be yet another self-reflection
Mhm.
by the polling industry.
Mhm.
Um, I think people are a little addicted to polls, and so
Mhm.
I'm not sure we're going to see them go away.
Mhm.
But again, what frustrates me the most about the whole situation is people say, well, the data is wrong. Well,
Mhm.
no, the data is not
Yeah,
wrong.
the number was correct.
Right. The
Mhm.
techniques may
Mhm.
not be giving
Mhm.
meaningful data or what
Right.
you can actually interpret, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that rampant speculation about who's ahead or behind is
Mhm.
necessarily better. It's
Mhm.
not necessarily better,
Right.
but we've got to put the tools in the
Mhm.
perspective that they have.
Mhm. Right. One of the things that I heard was, you have alluded to this, who responds. A lot of older people might not, if they don't recognize the number on caller ID, they're not going to answer it.
Right.
And youngsters,
No,
the younger demographics
no.
are like, okay, well, who's calling me? Simply because so many people might have their numbers. They're not going to eliminate. But and so yeah, it wouldn't have mattered who someone was for. It was just kind of, were they even going to answer the phone? The number of landlines is down. I mean, that's one of the biggies. And it's just, I mean, so many people, including my mother, who is 88 years old, no longer has a landline. She just has her cell phone. So, there's all of these varying things. Plus, it comes back to we didn't want to answer. And whether you were a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter, I think especially as it went on, it was like, ugh.
Well,
And
there is a bit
we
of
got pulled a
saturation.
lot. It was weird. You either got a lot of calls or none. We got
That's,
probably 2 in the evening sometimes.
I would suspect in Georgia, you got a lot of calls because
Mhm.
there's a lot of attention in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I think also that, if you think about the evolution of polling over time,
Mm-hmm.
yes, the old days, you have a phone book. That's the
Mm-hmm.
way people are pulling their
Right.
sort of random
Mm-hmm.
samples, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we've had the evolution, landlines to cell phones to
Mm-hmm.
online surveying,
Mm-hmm.
how do you reach different demographic
Mm-hmm.
groups? How do you reach different generations of
Mm-hmm.
voters? And what are the attitudes about these things?
Right.
So those are foundational issues that
Mm-hmm.
have to continue to be dealt with,
Mm-hmm.
getting to people in their ways. And again, I don't want to make it seem like they only use landline in polls, not all of them.
Right. Yeah, I
Some
got
of them
calls on
do.
my cell
Right,
phone.
right.
Mm-hmm.
But still, there is an over-reliance on older methodologies,
Mm-hmm.
and it is still like just not quite getting it right.
Right.
And I don't know if that's also a function of our politics. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it could well be that people just are not, if one side or the other is just systematically unwilling to participate in polling,
Mm-hmm.
a big problem
Right.
for the polls. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to offer the value judgment on society,
Right.
but I mean, for
Right.
polls, it is a big
Yeah.
problem.
And one of the things that, I've talked a lot about with my friends and, we've heard about is, in many cases, it wasn't that someone was voting for Biden. It was that they were voting against Trump, and so how they respond to questions regarding that is going to be very different also.
Well, I'd also think it's very difficult because we are in a, for lack of a better word, sort of a norm busting period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, there's a lot of similarities over time in politics. I think
Mm-hmm.
when you live in Washington, D.C. area, again, I'm not in politics at all, but I
Mm-hmm.
live here. So
it just kind of sucks into you.
Right. It's just sort of part of it. It's like, if you live in Los Angeles, that's where Hollywood is.
Right.
Kind of,
Mm-hmm.
right. And so for those of us that live here, and,
Mm-hmm.
most of my friends are not in politics, but, we're kind of here in the middle of all
Right.
this. So you've got this kind of interesting dynamic that happens in terms of what are the norms and sort of what are the basis people are voting. And then you see the sort of red states, blue states, and sort of the divide with the data again, like what does it look like? And, a part of it is just, it does seem like this is an era of incredible polarization.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At the same time, there are trends that are evolving that are really quite interesting to watch. Georgia is a fascinating place to watch because, and I sort of view Georgia as a few years behind Virginia used to be a battleground state.
Right.
And it is sort of in this year, the presidential candidates weren't here at all. But in 2008, they were all over Virginia, for example, right? And so you see this evolution, and and so when you start to look at demographic shifts and things like that, that's another way that data is very interesting, right? There has been interesting migration patterns from different locations, and whether it's around the cities or the suburbs, that is also going to affect the context of these issues. And it will have, I think right now the narratives you see are about sort of that supporting Democrats in certain states, but there's also a countervailing where there'll be Republican areas where people will move to, and that will change that. So as we look to this year's census, every 10 years we have the census. As we look to the data on the demographics, I actually think that for me personally is something I'm going to be very interested in thinking about. What is the data starting to show us about these longer term demographic trends and what that might mean for our politics and the degree of polarization?
Yeah. Who is living in a city and who has left, all of those various things. It's the whole polling thing. I mean, like I said, it's just so interesting to me. One of the things that is always, and not baffling, I mean, it's understandable, is how it gets reported by the media. And unfortunately, we no longer live in the time of Walter Cronkite with unbiased media. And so you just understand, okay, CNN's probably going to report it this way. Fox News is probably going to report it this way. So they can take the same poll and report it differently. And that's what gets really confusing.
Yeah, and I think it's I think there's two things. So let's start with an overarching media narrative, which I think is just an issue. And this is regardless of whether it's Fox News or CNN or anyone. Okay? There's a lot of obsession about the horse race. There's a lot of obsession about that. If you want to interpret data carefully, you need at least a modicum of care. And you can't just go with the headline, Biden leads Trump by 7 points. Well, what does that mean? Well,
what's the point?
Sometimes it's based on as little as 500 people. And so that's where sort of margins of error, but even then, margins of error are reported incorrectly. Again, I'm not here to do a whole statistics tutorial on these things, but the point is, because there's such an obsession about horse race from the polls, and even if they say, well, caveat, a point in time, caveat, it's a snapshot, the narrative that's created is this person's ahead or behind by this much, and this is what it's about.
Right.
And so I think that's always kind of tricky. I've talked to my friends about the fact that I sometimes think if they ever reported polls and said, by the way, that 7%, that 2% lead in this poll, that represents 6 people who'd have to change their mind,
Right.
or
Yeah.
10 people. You might think, wow, it's only 10 people different. I'm always thinking about, are there ways to sort of couch this information? So then you get to sort of the polarization of sort of left wing, right wing. What are the stories people are telling? Again, I try to be apolitical. I'm sort of a data guy. I want to be center. But once again, people can twist or use data or show it in sort of half ways, which doesn't always, maybe to support a narrative as opposed to the data actually providing an objective basis to refute something. And so a lot of what I try to do is talk about ways that people can protect themselves from being misled from media narratives. I did a TEDx talk a few years ago where we did headlines in sort of misleading ways that headlines, one of my favorites was, I think it was like 4 out of 5 CEOs are psychopaths.
Oh.
Right? But when we dug into the study, it wasn't 4 out of 5 CEOs, it was 4 out of 5 CEOs in the supply chain industry who had revenues of over 3 million, who responded to right.
So you've got 6 people you talk to.
Exactly right. And so I think, again, what I always try to advocate for people is people don't have to like math or statistics to be good consumers of data. To be a good consumer of data, you have to think a little harder and you have to sort of ask yourself some questions when you see numbers. And that's how I try to approach these. I think of it as like data literacy.
Right. And just knowing some of the basics, as you mentioned, how many did they interview? That's always one of the biggies. I saw some that were national polls and they talked to 100 people. Sure. There's no way that, that's any representation. I mean, that is such a minute number.
And what's so fascinating is, the power of polling is the idea that you are trying to predict what's going to happen with, 180, 190 million people from a very small sample. Now, that doesn't mean, there are statistical principles that tell us that actually it is amazing that we can actually predict.
It really does do pretty good.
Right. But when you get into any subgroup, is another one of my favorites. When you start to get into subgroups, every time you subdivide a sample, so let's say you started with 1,000 people, but then you're going to split it into, split it by states. Well, now you've got a big problem because you don't have any precision, right? So there are just limitations to what you can or can't squeeze out of the data. And I think a lot of it is sort of, it's a perspective that says, I don't want to be overly cynical about every number ever presented to me. But I do want to think about it and make sure I put in context so I know exactly what the limitations are.
Right. Yeah. Did they only interview people in major metropolitan areas on the West Coast? Right. Did they talk to anybody in Wyoming at all? A lot of things like that. And that's where, the consumer of the data, as you said, really should be educating themselves about it. And then this year, I mean, it really, I feel for pollsters. I mean, because there were major issues that then affected things. COVID obviously was a huge issue. Black Lives Matter was a huge issue. The police defunding ended up being a big issue. All sorts of things like that. And it's hard to ask questions. I don't even know if you can. I mean, now I have seen some of the poll results where they, were saying, you were asked, did you think enough was done about COVID, or, some things like that. Yeah. But even at that, that's subjective. I mean, how much is enough? I mean, one person is going to say, okay, we want to lock everything down and nobody moves. And the next person's like, make me wear a mask in Walmart and I'm okay.
Survey analysis is actually complicated, and you're pointing to the way questions are asked can greatly affect the results.
Right.
If you just simply see what the questions are that are asked in many of these polls, that's sometimes helpful for you to understand that perspective, right? And again, I'm not someone who takes I don't go to this thinking, well, every pollster is trying to rig their surveys.
No, they want their data to be good because they want to continue to be hired. Let's be honest.
Right. But at the same time, you are also right that I think with the COVID situation, I think it is very difficult to tell a lot of things about this election. I mean, in some respects, I think this is very atypical. even things like, door knocking didn't happen as much sort of by the Democratic Party. Well, that's
Right.
sort of one way. What is that? What did that do to the results in one way or another? How, if you're at home if you're working from home, does that mean people were more likely or less likely to actually answer their phone?
Right.
I mean, right. And so we're in a time period where it's just so different. And then you layer on top of that other types of information or disinformation. And I think, we have a lot of attention to, are people putting out disinformation about things on social media and how much is consumed? And do people increasingly turn for their news sources to one source or the other?
If you're getting your information from Facebook,
I might be cynical a little bit, but again, it's, so the point is just that it's a very challenging and sort of, the world is evolving. And so just because we have more data and more information doesn't necessarily mean the decision making is going to be better.
Right.
It actually means we have to be more vigilant and more thoughtful about how to interpret it.
Right. And it is difficult to be that pollster, as you mentioned. I mean, part of it is just simply in the training of the person who's asking the question. If somebody's, if I give an answer and they pause. Well, oh, they didn't like my answer. Maybe I better be careful how I answered it. Well, maybe they were just pausing because they took a sip of their water. I mean, all sorts of things like that. And so that's where it's hard to, or, is an older woman going to be more likely to respond to an older man who's asking questions? I mean, it's really, polling is extremely complicated.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to the science of polling. As I said, I'm not someone who conducts surveys as much as I look at the results on the back end, but it is absolutely the case. There is a lot that goes into thinking about how questions are asked. How do you create consistency? How do you not bias the result? How do you pick the samples? I mean, all of these things go into play. So it is not an easy thing. And then there's a lot of pollsters. I mean, you just go on any of these websites and you can see the proliferation of polls. And so ones are the good polls, which are the bad polls. And so it's like a lot of things. As I said, more is not always better.
Right.
Quality matters too.
Yeah. And it's just so tricky. And, and then of course there is the criticism that, when you put out all this data, maybe people are going to go, well, I don't need to vote because the election, it's already determined. They don't need my vote one way or the other. And that was where it was actually nice to see how many people turned out to vote. But then it's made complicated when you add in early voting. I mean, we could vote in Georgia, I believe 3 weeks in advance. And so polls taken after that, that's going to be very different. All of these various things. It's just it is a very complicated process now.
Well, and again, this was a particularly interesting election. The early voting is a phenomenon I think we will have to deal with for years. Right? Are we moving from election day to election weeks? And that's perfectly fine. I mean, again, I'm not passing a value judgment on it.
Right. You just adjust how you're doing it.
Just how you do it, right? And so, and similarly, you always hear about, who's the most popular person around election time? The undecided voter, right? You always see these TV shows where people talk about, are they undecided? And I think one of the things that people in Washington, D.C. sometimes miss is that not everybody lives and breathes this stuff every day. There's a lot of people in a lot of parts of the country where when it's time to focus on the election, they do, and they're not up and down with every tweet and every news story. And so again, there's a bit of a perspective where how do you collect smart, informative data if you don't understand the context around where you're collecting the data from or how people are thinking about it? And so maybe there's some room for some more reflection on that issue in terms of, what are the real differences? Is the way I'm going to have to approach this in certain parts of the country just different to actually ever get accurate information?
Right. And then unfortunately, we're going to have the people that say, let's just throw it all out. It doesn't matter. We don't care. There are people who, who I vote for is not going to be swayed in any way by a celebrity or a sports figure. And so there are also people who are going to say, well, I don't care what the poll says. I'm going to do one thing or another. And of course, we're talking, clearly about political polling. There's, many things that people get polled for, but it's just, the big thing is if you're giving a poll, you need to make sure that you have really reviewed how it's taking, and then of course the other thing is if you're looking at the results, you need to again analyze it to see exactly what was talked about and how it was done, if possible.
Yeah, and I think, again, the basis upon which any individual votes, I mean, that's so complicated and so individualized. So let's go back to what can a poll tell you or not at a point in time, assuming you actually have a representative sample of the people that are going to vote on election day. It tells you how they would choose at that point in time. What you could know. That's assuming.
And tomorrow it might change. I mean, that's the whole complicated process.
And then because you're only getting a sample, a small group of people, you have a bunch of error in that. That's not about that. Happens simply as a matter of statistics, right? When we do small samples, we're not, yes, there is a way to get a really accurate poll. It's called the election.
Because I mean, I've talked to people who have been polled and they have told me I lied. And I'm like, and I mean, that is obviously built in. That a certain number of people are, for whatever reason, not going to be truthful with their answers. And so that's why it's, you've got that margin of error. I mean, that is just kind of one of the things in there.
We're always trying to guess. I was trying to guess how can we use our experience from the past to inform the future?
Right.
Just like polling, I mean, all data analysis, whether you're doing it in a company, whether you're doing it, past is prologue, right? As a starting point. If the number of people that are aligned to a pollster is different now than it was, 4 years ago, we're going to get it wrong, even if we try to correct for it.
Right. And then of course, how do you know? I mean, that's, just because they tell you I'm going to vote for X person doesn't, they may or may not be telling the truth, and you don't know. I mean, that's just, again, that's the margin of error.
Oh, I agree. I think it's again, as we are kind of trying to catch our collective breath, and election, is over. I'm not trying to say anything controversial, but as we looks pretty clear, the election is over.
Right.
We're going to sort of look back and do sort of the postmortem on what the polls showed and what can't be learned. I hope that the continued changing demographics, the continued changing in the way people respond to polls, for polls to be credible for the long run, they will have to grapple with these issues.
Right.
Really hard. As I said, though, when you take it, the takeaway right now, though, the disturbing part of this year's polling misses, and in some respects, I think it's more disturbing than 2016, is it looks like early that it's just all in the same direction.
Right.
You don't want that's you don't want that. That's
right. Yeah. And I don't, maybe I'm being Pollyanna, but I don't think that it was done deliberately. I think it was just kind of a combination of the moon and the stars and everything else. I mean, it was just strange.
Yeah, no, well, I think, again, we're in an exceptional time. So that makes it hard. Again, data is one tool. It is a tool, though, and it can only be as good as what, the interpretation has to be tied to what it actually represents.
Right. And businesses use data all the time. And so, we'll swing this back towards a business discussion. You get ready to develop a new product. So you have a focus group. How do you ask those questions? All of these various things. And, and again, it's the, how you are asking, what you're doing that really does, because again, you want to make sure you have the right data, especially if you're a business getting ready to sink hundreds, thousands, millions of dollars into product development, all of those various things. And so that's why it's very tricky from a business perspective to make sure that you're getting good data.
Yeah, I think that, back to the issue of simply, how do people talk about data? How do people use data? In a company, in a business setting, I think data can be an incredibly empowering tool. But I think of it, again, sometimes people think of it as a panacea, like it's going to solve all your problems. Right. I don't think that's the right perspective. Again, I'm a data-oriented guy, and but I think what you really have to do to sort of get good to think about this issue as a business person is, if you're going to make decisions, and you're going to invest however hundreds of millions of dollars in something, I don't think I want to make that decision entirely based on my gut reaction or
right. Yeah. I might think it's the greatest thing in the world, but the rest of the world might not.
But I could be wrong, right? So you've got to be willing to look at data in a way that is going to either confirm or not confirm your prior beliefs. And that's where there are all sorts of biases when people do this. And so the idea of framing the question up front, what is the question you want to answer? What is the data you have available to you? So we're talking about a context in a marketing setting where people are doing small focus groups and things like that. I often talk to companies about, I call it sort of data facilitation. How do you use the various data sets at your disposal within your company that actually were used for the purpose of ordinary course of business, your payroll data set versus your HR database versus a timekeeping database. Or sometimes it's a productivity database, or your financials, your P&Ls. How can you combine that information together to answer questions that are meaningful for you? So you sort of hit on it early on, though, in sort of the way you set up this section of our discussion, which is, what is the question I'm trying to answer? What data can actually help me answer it? And then I can think about, all right, well, what's the analysis I need to conduct? But if you don't spend the time to set the table, if you don't spend the time to actually think, okay, what are we trying to understand? Then you can have lots of data analyses that can just be squished and pushed and moved and around and sort of, there's nothing worse than people just talking past each other with data. You want to really sort of do something that's pretty firm. And also, again, that discipline of, here's the thought process, here's what the data is, that helps you get to a better answer. In the real world, you have to get to an answer. I can't, as a leader, I own and run a company. I have to make decisions. And I can't wait till I have 100% certainty in the data all the time to make those decisions. What I try to do is identify, what can I learn from the data? What's the whole? I'm going to make the best decision I can, and then I'm going to continue to update the data to see if I can fill in the things I don't know.
Right.
That's the way I approach it.
Right. And speaking of filling in the holes, the biggest data kind of confusion right now is COVID. And from a business perspective, it's just so confusing, because it varies every day. It doesn't, and it varies during the day. That's how many cases, and again, it comes back to, how is it being reported? Who is recording it? And, let's be honest, there have been some political ramifications in some of this, but, it is one of those weird things. But as a business owner, you're thinking, one of the biggest things that many people are thinking, especially if you have employees, they've been working remotely. When is it safe to have them come back? And you're looking at this data thinking, I don't know.
Yeah, look, so COVID has been a game changer for just about every business. And our analytics firm has done a lot of sort of public studies on COVID in terms of just different ways to put the data out there. One of our high profile projects actually is we did some work for the NFL Players Association. We actually built a dashboard for them in each NFL franchise city where we put up updated information on the number of COVID cases and hospitalizations, things like that.
Right.
And a lot of our initial approach to this when we've dealt with companies is sort of, well, let's just get some factual basis. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I feel like I've had to become one for the purposes of conducting even economic analysis. So the first thing, and I think at least we've started to evolve, it seems like there's at least more consistency in terms of the testing. But if you go back early in the days when the test, who were the people that were most likely to be tested early on?
Right.
The sick people.
Yeah. So you were probably going to have a pretty high positivity rate.
Right. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean it's not serious and contagious. It means that even what you can get from those samples early on. Now we've moved to a new phase where there's cases are really skyrocketing, unfortunately, and some of that's been predicted by some of our officials. And,
right. Yeah. It was just kind of going to happen with holidays and cold weather. That was, I think you'd have to be kind of silly to not think, oh, I bet the numbers are going to go up.
So now that we're in that circumstance, as companies are dealing with the reality of these issues, I think the ability to sort of know what our public health officials are telling us is helpful. Again, as a business leader, I want to understand that. The data that we collect, we do sort of, as I said, we look at sort of different COVID cases in different locations. Our firm is mainly in Los Angeles and DC. So those are the two, major metropolitan areas. And then, we have done surveys of our employees about their comfort level, because one of the other parts about this is sort of both a combination of risk aversion, different people feel more or less concerned, and you need to be receptive to that. So we personally at our firm have collected data on that as we try to keep sort of tabs on our employees and where they're at. And then, of course, the well-being of our employees and how easily can we work remotely. We're sort of fortunate that we work in my particular industry, since we're doing data analyses. We do a lot of, I'm tired of Zoom.
Wherever you have internet, you can work.
Right. There are other jobs that's not the case. And so sort of striking that balance from a business perspective too. But even that has required a great deal of monitoring. And I don't mean monitoring like, oh, what are you doing every hour of the day, but more like, how do you make sure employees continue to have work to do when you know, how much work happens where you see something else, oh, I need something else to do, oh, I need this done. Now it's got to be all mapped out. And so for, you know, some of our best practices have been to create sort of reports that go to all of our seniors that maybe we weren't even as a data-driven company, we really ramped up our reporting and how we kind of keep track of people and responsibilities and things like that. And so again, I think data can be a tool to help tailor to the individual business problems business leaders are happening. But again, it's not going to be a panacea, and this answer is not clearly going to be the same for every business. So it is tricky. And you know, the other thing I will say is, if you go back in time, I even know for my business, sort of as I've been monitoring what drives demand for our work, where I was in February, March, where I was in June, where I am today are very different places. So this other part of it is I try to gauge, well, what is you know, there's a lot of talk about the V-shaped recovery. V-shaped, I always say it looks a lot more like a Nike swoosh. But that's uneven. That's not across all industries. And so again, you know, when I'm looking at economic data, I'm trying to understand, okay, well, where are we seeing sort of rebounds? Where are we seeing soft spots? And why is that occurring? And how does that play into my business? So I think data can be incredibly informative. But again, there's a lot of it. And we're dealing with an unprecedented situation. I can't go back to the 1920 pandemic. Hey, what can I learn about what was happening in the Woodrow Wilson administration? You know, that's not.
I've actually seen some people doing that. I'm like, no. I mean, now granted, there are a handful of industries that are similar enough that, okay, that might work, but yeah, for the most part, no.
I just don't, that doesn't feel like past is prologue enough. I mean, I might learn some interesting historical things, but that's not the basis I want to make my decisions on. I'm a lot more interested in sort of what's happened in deep recessions in the 80s, 2009, in terms of what a recovery might look like, or also, you know, places or cities where there were natural disasters like a hurricane, or, you know, how did economies recover from that kind of shock? And so,
and September 11th is probably a fairly good, you know, but that was so short term. You know, we had about 2 weeks where we went, oh my gosh, and then everything for the most part got back to kind of normal.
I mean, it took time for sort of the travel industry to recover and that, but at the same time, this is a sustained, prolonged. I mean, we could be. I mean, it's
We don't know when it's going to end.
I mean, we went into sort of the work from home lockdown the day after my birthday in March, so I remember really clearly, like March 13th.
Right.
You know,
oh yeah.
The notion that like. In my birthday this year, we probably still will be home.
At least to some degree.
Right, exactly. Even if we have a vaccine or something, we're not all going to be back fully. You know, this is not instantaneous. So I just think the data helps us to try to put, you know, get the best information we can, think about the problems as systematically as we can. There's no blueprint though. There's no, you know, oh, just do it this way. I mean, that's the hard part about these things. That's why you have to think about them. You know, and again, it's as a business leader, it's been a frustrating time. I'm not used to managing a firm remotely. I'm not used to all that diversity of issues or navigating the various, you know, there's a very stressed out employees are difficult to manage. And so it really is calling upon the combination of your business acumen, your leadership skills, and then supplementing that with data is the way I get through to try to figure it out.
Right. You know, and I've kind of made the assumption since, you know, Mayish when we were going through this, that many businesses would think we're going to continue working remotely. You know, it's less expensive, you know, especially if they were renting fairly expensive space. You know, even if they own their own building, might be easier to try and sell it. Now, I wouldn't want to be a commercial realtor right now, but you know, and having people at home, you know, as long as people have the right equipment to do what they need to be doing, they can be functioning. But you know, you brought something up, and is that what the employees want? For some of them, they want to be back in the office for a variety of reasons. You know, and I mean, some of them want to be away from their kids. Now, you know, okay, they still have to be homeschooled, so I'm not sure how that works. But you know, someone like my husband, one of the things, he's been home since early March. They've been told January at least. His team works better when they are together, just for a variety of reasons. And, he said frequently it's things like you just have a quick question. Well, you can't get him on the phone. You can't email him. But you could go, hey, to the person in the next cubicle, and so it's as you said, we've got to get back to asking the employees, and whether it's formal or informal, just, hey, how you doing today, John? Is there anything we could be doing to make things better? Or what about if we come back to work in a hybrid situation? What would you see in that? All sorts of things. And I think that's what we're kind of missing, is taking into account what our employees want.
I think, as we think about productivity, right? The idea that you can take a workforce that was largely working in an office context and move them all home and assume the productivity is going to be identical.
Right.
And again, I don't think it goes all one way or the other. I think there are some things that might be much more productive from home, and I think there are others.
Right.
But I think a really good perspective, a sort of twofold, is, our early sort of polling of our workforce has been about their level of anxiety and their comfort level. Is, we don't want anxious workers.
Right.
It's not going to help us to perform.
They'll make mistakes, know.
But then there's also the productivity issues. When you're dealing with data, are there ways that, being together is more helpful? How have you had to adjust? Do we have substitutes for sort of the team meeting or these types of things? And so I do think organizations are just up and down, large, small organizations are trying to figure out what are the best practices? How do you thread the needle in a situation like this to do the best you can? And again, I don't think there's any single best practice per se, but I do think the idea, it's not going to be suddenly nobody's going to go back to work in person either, because there was a reason all these workforces were set up that way. And you allude to the personal things. I mean, homeschooling now, you've got people that have to deal with that. You've got some people that live alone where their major social interaction was with their
they're getting depressed just because they're not seeing people.
Right. And so there's a lot. It's a very complex social issue. I suspect that, where you're going to see doctoral dissertations on this time period.
Oh, yeah.
Years after this, right?
Right.
But it would be fascinating if it wasn't our real life. And so, again, I throughout have tried to take a perspective of staying as calm as I can and measured, trying to be data driven where I can be, but also understanding that we're dealing with people. And, the data can tell me certain things. Data can't tell me everything about how employee X is going to respond to whatever is going on in the world. And so it's challenging.
Right. And then again, it comes back to how you're asking the questions and who. If your boss is asking you, hey, do you want to come back into the office? You might give a very different answer than if it's a true third party who's asking you that. And so there's, that's where it gets really tricky. But obviously we want to encourage people. You've got to be, those lines of communication have got to be open with your employees, and just figuring out what's going to work. And even processes, I've talked to people who have figured out that, that the working at 10 a.m., they're just not morning people. So if you tell them, in a normal work environment, they're going to work 8 to 5, well, they might be much more productive late afternoon and evening. Clearly homeschooling is really messing with people's schedules, all sorts of things like that. And so it is, and I don't know, maybe you do online polls so nobody's asking that question. You don't have those dramatic pauses. Oh God, I just gave the wrong answer. All of those various things. It's going to be a combination of things, and then it has to change, because what works this month might not work next month.
We've been trying again. I mean, I can just sort of from our case study perspective, we've started having essentially what our regular morning meetings with the entire firm every day, just sort of have a kickoff point. And then we have team meetings, and team meetings are smaller groups where people can sort of ask if they need something to do. We have some reporting on those types of things. I mean, we've tried to put in some processes to just heighten the communication. Because you don't have that luxury of, okay, I'm
stopping by the cubicle.
Yeah. And so, again, we have sort of formal information gathering, like the kind of surveys you're talking about. They're still informal. And again, we just are trying to do the best we can in the environment. Again, I think sometimes people mistake that being a data-driven organization means that I literally look at, productivity measures for every person, and I look
Right.
at attitudinal surveys, and I'm
Yeah,
doing
you've got something attached to their
that.
computer that's telling
Yeah,
you every keystroke.
that's not what I mean by a data-driven
Mm-hmm.
organization. What I mean by a data-driven organization is one that takes data seriously to
Mm-hmm.
answer important questions,
Right.
understands both the strengths and
Mm-hmm.
weaknesses of data, and implements it as
Mm-hmm.
a tool in the decision
Mm-hmm.
making, but not the entirety of the decision.
Right. Right. And then it is a combination of things. We're as you said, we're doing a lot of things on Zoom now. So you've got, say, your morning meetings. You might have asked questions, all of these various things, but from an HR perspective, or it's not really HR, but an intuitive, I'm not even quite sure how to word it. You need to be cognizant of just paying attention to some of the things that are happening to people. Are the people that normally came in with all of their calls and in their polo shirts and they look like this, now are they in scraggly t-shirts? And which, I mean, that's not a bad thing, but are they in the scraggly t-shirt because they might be getting depressed? And the problem with Zoom is we've got people from mid chest up. We're not getting a lot of body language, things that you would get just from being in your in-person meetings. So that's what makes it hard too. Is we've got to be picking up on all of those signs.
Right. And I think, again, I try not to be, I don't try to overread the data. For our firm, we've taken some sort of, I think, that are just sound policies. We've had some mental health awareness sessions
Right.
where we've had outside counselors in, and opportunities for seminars and things on managing stress and things like that. We make outside counseling services available to our employees, and we always have them, but we are really publicizing them now in a way. We are trying to watch for these different sort of signs. Again, it's very difficult. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily purely data driven, other than just the volume of things we try to do.
Right.
But again, back to repeated touch points, repeated communications, that's data too. People don't always think about these things as data. Now, some of it might be biased in one way or another. I get that. But as a practical matter, what you are talking about is synthesizing whatever information you have at your disposal on the state of your workforce, trying to be actionable about it. And I think that as an employer, that's what you can do. Or foolish not to.
Right. Right. And obviously the workforce is going to change. Whether it's long-term or short-term. I think one of the things, because I think many companies are going to say, okay, people can work from home in a hybrid, 100% home, all those various things. But then, of course, you have the question that comes in with, well, do they still have to be in the same physical location? If I kind of joked before, as long as you've got internet, you can work from wherever. Okay. That's cool. I'm going to go to the beach, and as long as you're getting your work done, who the heck cares? But it's going to give employers the opportunity to expand their workforces, whether it's just, other states, other locations, out of the country. I mean, all these various things. And so they're going to have to know, okay, if I've got a bunch of employees who are now 4 time zones away, how do we function? All sorts of things like that.
Yeah, I think, again, more as a business leader, I think we just have to be cautious, and we should have to play this out a little bit. I don't think we're ready to have a remote, universal workforce.
Right.
And I don't think, but I think many companies will be confronting these issues. I still think right now we're still in sort of the middle of a crisis, but I think as we come out of it, I think there will be sort of an interesting to watch how that happens. And again, I suspect people will start to be thinking about productivity data. And how do you measure whether this job can really be effective? And does that create disproportionate burdens on people in the office versus not? And so there will be a whole host of new data questions to be answered. I'm just not sure the data right now is incredibly representative of ultimately what the experience will be. But there's probably some really good lessons to be learned.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it's such a fluid situation. One of the things is homeschooling. You send your kids to school and you think, oh, I can finally, and then whoop, they're back home again. And so, your question yesterday is very different than your question today of your employees. And, you mentioned the NFL. sports. I mean, all these various things. I'm down here in Georgia, and they just announced a little bit ago that University of Georgia's football game will not be played this weekend. Everything is just so fluid that it's very hard to get a grasp on things. But that's where it comes back to the data, because the data is going to give you, when approached the right way, the answers that you need as much as it possibly can.
Yeah, I think, we are in a time where we are all looking for certainty in any number of places, especially how little certainty there is. And so the way I think about data is, can it provide us at least some insights
Right.
so we're informed? Not going to get everything right. We're not going to necessarily have every answer. But I think in a time when we're desperate for some degree of certainty, or at least being able to figure out which questions we can or can't answer, it should provide some comfort that there's a little bit more structure to how to think about problem solving. Because at the end of the day, all of these things are problems. But it's an anxious time. It's a difficult economic time. I always think about the fact, we have this unprecedented situation where a health crisis has led to an economic crisis. Between that and the election and the racial tensions, it's just that 2020 is going to be a year we're all unfortunately going to remember for a long time.
It's going to become, we're going to, anytime something bad happens, we're going to go, 2020.
2020, right, exactly. That's our life, and so it is a challenging time, but I'd like to try to think of it as, in challenging times are where opportunities come about. To improve processes, to think about how you can use more information or different information, how to think about problems differently. So that's sort of the perspective that I've tried to take as a business leader. And it's kind of like, let's make some lemonade out of the lemons. That's what we do.
Oh yeah, you have to. And that's been the interesting thing, is to see how many companies have, we're going to use the key word for right now, pivot. That's one of the words of 2020 is we're going to pivot. And how many companies really are doing pretty well with doing that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that we do with our analytics companies, we have this thing called the data blueprint, where we sort of provide consulting, where when someone has a question and they don't want to hire us to do all this work, they just want to talk about a data problem. We try to help frame their question. Like, okay, here's the problem you're facing, and here's how to use the data you have to answer it yourself. And I kind of call it like DIY data analysis. But I think what is interesting about that is, you're right, is, many companies are forcing themselves right now, either by necessity or because of opportunity, to sort of make a pivot and think about, well, what can I do instead? Or how do I serve this market? Or how has the change in the world meant that what I was doing before isn't going to work the same way? And so, it is sometimes out of great crisis is where great entrepreneurship comes from. So again, I try to be positive, and, if you have to give it economic indicators or things like that, I'd be a little depressed. But thinking more about, kind of like, is there potential for a great deal of economic activity and change? There is. And that's what we can all hope for.
I love it. I love it. Well, oh my gosh. This is why I set a timer, because we could go on talking about this. And like I said, one and one don't make two for me, but I love this. I mean, I geek out on this stuff. This is very cool. So I've been having so much fun talking with you. But tell us, what services Edgeworth Analytics can provide to organizations?
Well, basically, as I said, we are, think of us as sort of data teachers. So we're here to help facilitate or help you frame the problems you might have. We work with all sorts of different types of companies, all different types of organizations, large, small. If you have a data problem or a problem where you think, I think data could help me, we're kind of someone you can turn to. So edgeworthanalytics.com is our website. That's the place to find us. And you can see the types of things we do. But think of us as sort of like a Swiss Army knife for data problems. That's the way I like to describe it.
I love it. And obviously it's a virtual world now, so you can work with people anywhere.
Anywhere. It's pretty easy. Yeah, you can see the baseball pictures behind me from anywhere in the world.
I love it. I love it. Well, what final thoughts do you have for us?
Well, I would just say again, look, obviously everybody stays safe and healthy, of course, in this environment. But again, just sort of this idea that data is a tool. It is not a replacement for all decision making, but the notion of, as we are faced with different, more difficult, challenging problems, the notion that data can help as opposed to obscure, I think that's a perspective I'd just like people to remember, because data used properly can be incredibly powerful.
I love it. I love it. Well, this really has been fascinating. I think it's so much fun to talk about this, and it would be fun to revisit this conversation And maybe once the pandemic has calmed down, just to see how companies settled and things like that. So it'd be great to have you on again. But until then, I'm Deb Creer. I've been talking with Dr. John Johnson of Edgeworth Analytics. And until next time, everyone have a great day.
Tune in for our next program for even more trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. The Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer, is proud to be part of the C-Suite Network.